6,000 people still turn up for work every morning at the Nissan factory in Sunderland. It is the largest car plant left in Britain. For 40 years, it has built Qashqais and Jukes on the banks of the Wear. Right now, roughly half of that plant is standing quiet. So Nissan has signed a non-binding agreement with a Chinese company to put cars on the empty line. From 2027, the biggest car factory in this country could be building Chery vehicles. 10 British car plants, and what happened to every one of them? Number 1 is still open. That is the problem. One figure explains almost everything else in this story. Chinese brands took 15% of the British new car market in the first half of 2026. Roughly 175,000 cars out of 1.13 million. 2 years earlier, BYD had only just arrived and the Chery group was barely visible here. The JQ7, built by Chery, became one of the top-selling new cars in Britain. In March, it briefly sat at the very top of the monthly chart, ahead of familiar names like the Ford Puma and the Nissan Qashqai. In July, Chery on its own registered more cars than Honda and Mazda put together, 3,212 against their combined 2,912. Chery only started selling cars here in early 2025. 19 months. You have owned pairs of shoes for longer than that. Hold that thought, because to understand why Sunderland matters, you need to see what came before it. This is the story of what Britain used to build and what is replacing it. Ford opened the Bridge and Engine plant in South Wales in 1980. At its height, it made engines for Jaguar, Land Rover, and Ford's own cars and was one of the biggest employers in the area. Ford confirmed the closure in 2019, and production ended the following year. 1,700 jobs disappeared almost overnight. Ford said Brexit was not the main reason. The company pointed to falling demand for the engines Bridge produced and to a wider European restructuring that affected several sites. Whatever the cause, the effect on the town was the same. A plant that had run for 4 decades stopped, and the people who worked there went home. An engine plant does not only employ the people inside the gates, it supports a whole network of machining shops, tooling firms, transport companies, and local suppliers. Small companies with nowhere else to sell their work suddenly lose their biggest customer. If you live in a town that has a big factory, you already know how that chain works. When the main plant closes, the damage spreads far beyond the people who clocked in there every morning. Shops, cafes, taxi drivers, and small businesses all feel it. Bridgen was not just a factory. It was part of the economic backbone of that part of South Wales for a generation. Honda's plant at Swindon was larger, and the loss hit harder. Honda opened there in the mid-1980s. By the 2010s, it was one of the 4 biggest car factories in the country, building the Civic and other models for the European market. When Honda announced the closure in 2019, it meant 3,500 jobs at the plant itself. The Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders estimated that the site supported around 10,000 more jobs in the wider supply chain. 3,500 inside the gates, 10,000 outside them. If your job was one of those 10,000, no formal letter arrived on your doormat. Honda spoke of unprecedented changes in the global car industry and the need to concentrate electric production in regions with the highest demand. It insisted Brexit was not the reason. Production ended in 2021. In its final years, the plant was building around 150,000 Civics a year in a factory that had capacity for 250,000. It was running at roughly 60%. That underuse figure is important because you will see the same pattern later at Sunderland. When a plant runs well below its designed capacity for years, the economics start to look fragile. The fixed costs of keeping the buildings, the equipment, and the skilled workforce ready stay high even when the output falls. Honda decided the numbers no longer worked for its global plans, and the plant closed. Vauxhall built vehicles in Luton for 120 years, through 2 world wars and through the collapse of most of the rest of the British motor industry. If you grew up anywhere in this country in the last 50 years, you have almost certainly sat in something that came out of that town. A Cavalier, an Astra, a Corsa. Someone in your family drove one. Stellantis confirmed the closure and put around 1,100 jobs at risk. Luton Council said the economic damage to the town would be substantial. The union called it a disgrace and a slap in the face to the workforce. Stellantis pointed to the zero-emission vehicle mandate, the rules that require manufacturers to sell a rising percentage of electric cars in Britain every year. The company said publicly that the mandate was hurting its business model because customer demand for electric cars was not matching the targets being set. So the Vauxhall badge survives. You can still buy a Corsa or a Mokka tomorrow. But Vauxhall, as a British manufacturing presence that actually made the cars yours, has gone. The site that once turned out family cars for decades is no longer producing vehicles. The badge lives on as a brand under foreign ownership. But the factory that gave the name its meaning for British buyers has closed. In the summer of 2024, the last Jaguar F-Type came off the line at Castle Bromwich in Birmingham. With it went the XE and the XF. That was the end of the plant as a car factory. It was also the end of something else. The F-Type was presented as the spiritual successor to the E-Type, the car that Enzo Ferrari is said to have called the most beautiful ever made. When that car stopped, Jaguar stopped building sports cars in Britain. Jaguar's position is that the stop was planned rather than forced. The company deliberately ended production of its entire previous range so it could relaunch as an electric brand. You cannot sell cars you're not building. That argument is fair on its own terms. But planning a stop does not make the factory floor any less empty. If you own an F-Type, you own one of the last ones made in Britain. Castle Bromwich is not building Jaguars today. The decision was presented as a strategic reset, yet the practical result is the same as the closures that came before it. A long-running British production site stops making the cars that carried the badge. Longbridge matters most for this story because it is the clearest precedent for everything now being discussed at Sunderland. Longbridge was the old Austin Works in Birmingham, more than 100 years of car manufacturing. When MG Rover went into administration in April 2005, around 5,900 people lost their jobs immediately. It was the end of British-owned volume car production in this country. Look at what happened to the Longbridge site next, because this is the part many people forget. Before the collapse, Shanghai Automotive was already in talks about investment, and reports at the time suggested plans that involved shifting production of certain models to China and exporting cars back to Britain. After the administration, the MG name and the Longbridge site ended up in Chinese hands. The factory limped on, assembling MG sports cars under Chinese ownership, until production there finally stopped in 2016. Read that sequence again because you're going to see versions of it later. A British car company fails. A Chinese company takes the badge. The factory carries on for a while building cars for the new owner. Then it stops. 21 years later, MG is the largest Chinese brand in Britain, registering more than 48,000 cars in the first half of this year alone, up 14%. It has more than 150 dealerships here, broader coverage than Mazda or Honda. MG now outsells the British brands it used to be. There's a good chance you have seen 3 of them on the road today without thinking about it. The badge survived. The original British manufacturing base did not. If you have ever worked in a car plant, or your dad did, or your granddad did, type the number 1 in the comments. Just the number 1. I read every single one of them, and I want to see how many of us are still out there. And if you have not subscribed, please do. It is free, it takes a second, and it is the only reason this channel can keep putting this kind of work together. From this point, the plants we talk about are still open, but the pressure on them is real. Solihull, Halewood, and the related Jaguar Land Rover sites are still running. They still build Range Rovers, Defenders, Discoveries, and Evokes. They are the biggest thing Britain still has in volume car making, which is exactly why what happened last autumn was so serious. On the 1st of September 2025, all 3 stopped. Not because of a strike. Jaguar Land Rover was hit by a cyber attack and shut down its entire computer network. When a modern car plant loses its computers, it loses everything. Production schedules, parts tracking, quality systems, logistics. For 5 weeks, Britain's biggest car maker built nothing at all. British car production fell by more than a third across the whole country in that month. It was the worst September for car making here in 70 years. One monitoring centre put the total damage to the UK economy at £1.9 billion. The plants came back, but the year's results told the story. Profit before tax at Jaguar Land Rover fell from more than $2 billion to $14 million. 99% of the profit of Britain's biggest car maker disappeared in 1 year, with further job cuts confirmed later. Solihull and Halewood are still running, but they are running with far less margin for error than anyone assumed. And if you own a Range Rover or a Defender, that is your dealer network and your parts supply too. A single cyber incident exposed how fragile even the strongest remaining British volume producer has become. Here's the honest state of British car manufacturing in 2026. We still build cars, and some of them are excellent. Range Rovers and Defenders at Solihull, Minis at Oxford, Toyotas at Burniston, Qashqais and Jukes, and the new electric models at Sunderland. Nissan employs around 7,000 people across the UK, including a design centre and an engineering centre. But every one of those plants is foreign-owned now. Japanese, German, Indian, American, Chinese. The last British-owned volume manufacturer disappeared in 2005 at Longbridge. That is not a moral judgment about any of those factories. Foreign investment built modern British car manufacturing. Nissan came to Sunderland in the 1980s precisely because Britain wanted it, and it worked. Sunderland became the biggest car plant in the country and for years one of the most productive in Europe. The point is simply this. When a plant here becomes surplus to a foreign parent's needs, the decision is not made in Britain. It is made in Tokyo or Paris or Mumbai. And you have watched that decision go against this country at Bridgend, at Swindon, at Luton, and at Longbridge. The pattern is consistent. Ownership sits elsewhere. Strategic choices are made elsewhere. Local communities live with the consequences. While those plants were closing or struggling, something else was growing on British forecourts. BYD registered more than 51,000 cars in Britain in 2025 and outsold Tesla. The Chery Group, which owns Omoda and JQ, as well as the Chery brand itself, arrived properly in 2025 and has already taken a noticeable share of the market on its own. Chinese brands as a whole reached around 15% of the British market in the first half of this year, and analysts expect that figure to keep rising. Chinese cars now outsell Japanese and South Korean cars in Britain. These cars are not growing the overall market so much as taking share from it. Of the growth in the British new car market in the early months of the year, the large majority came from a handful of Chinese brands. Every extra sale they make is a sale taken from someone else, from Ford, from Nissan, from Honda, from Vauxhall. Look at the price and you can see why. An Omoda 5 starts around £24,000 before discounts. The cheapest comparable Nissan Qashqai is around £30,000 with less equipment in some cases. If you are choosing a car this weekend, that is not a patriotic decision. It is a £6,000 decision. And £6,000 is £6,000. Buyers are responding to value, equipment levels, and warranty length. The established brands are feeling the pressure in the sales charts. The Freelander story is genuinely strange, and most people in Britain have not heard it yet. You probably owned one or knew somebody who did. Land Rover built the Freelander from 1997 to 2015. It was Europe's top-selling 4x4 for a period, and it was the first vehicle in the world to offer hill descent control. Then it was discontinued, replaced by the Discovery Sport, and most people assumed the name was finished. Jaguar Land Rover has now licensed the Freelander name to its Chinese joint venture with Chery. Freelander has been relaunched not as a Land Rover model, but as a separate brand built in China on a Chery platform and sold through Chery-related dealerships. Several models are planned over 5 years with global export ambitions, and the UK is explicitly in the picture. The first production car was unveiled in China this spring. At the Chery Jaguar Land Rover plant, the last combustion Range Rover Evoque came off the line as Freelander launched. When Jaguar Land Rover's own leadership was asked whether the company would block Chery from selling Freelanders in Britain, the reported answer was that it is Chery's car, and they would let them. So a British badge on a Chinese car sold to you in Britain with the original owner's blessing. The name that once stood for a British-built family 4x4 is now attached to a Chinese-built product sold through a different network. And here we are at the Sunderland plant. It opened in 1986. It is the biggest car factory in the United Kingdom. It employs around 6,000 people directly, and it builds the Qashqai and the Juke, two of the best-selling cars in the country, alongside the new electric models. It is the heart of Nissan's plan to turn Sunderland into an electric manufacturing hub. It is also running at roughly 50% of its capacity. Half of Britain's biggest car factory is doing nothing. In May, Nissan announced it would consolidate manufacturing onto a single production line as part of a cost reduction that involved around 900 job losses across Europe. That left the second line available. And in June, Nissan and Chery International UK signed a non-binding memorandum of understanding to study contract manufacturing. Under the terms being discussed, Nissan would build Chery passenger vehicles on the idle line at Sunderland, potentially from the 2027 financial year. The plant stays fully owned by Nissan. The workers stay employed by Nissan. Chery builds the JQ 7, which as of this year is one of the most registered cars in Britain. I want to be careful about Sunderland because this is not a done deal. The memorandum is explicitly non-binding. Discussions are ongoing. Nissan has said no further details are being made public at this stage. It may not happen at all, but think about what the proposal alone tells you. Britain's biggest car factory has so much spare capacity that its own owner is considering renting half of it to a company that did not sell you a single car 3 years ago. The empty space exists because demand for the cars Nissan itself builds there has not filled the plant. The logical next step in pure business terms is to fill that space with someone else's volume. There is a genuinely strong case for the Sunderland deal, and you should hear it before you make up your mind. Unite's national officer welcomed it. He described it as very good news for Nissan Sunderland workers and for the UK automotive industry at a time of real uncertainty for the sector, and made the point that Chinese vehicles are increasingly visible on British roads, so it makes sense for UK workers to build them here as well. Unite is right, and it is not a small point. An idle production line employs nobody. A busy one employs British workers in Sunderland, paying British tax, feeding a British supply chain, and spending money in British shops. If Chinese cars are going to be sold here in these numbers regardless, and they are, then building them in Sunderland is better for that region than shipping them in from China. There is also a factory precedent that cuts the other way from Longbridge. Contract manufacturing is normal in this industry. Companies in Austria and Finland already build cars for several different brands. A plant building somebody else's product is not automatically a defeat. It is a business model that keeps the lights on and the pay packets arriving, and Nissan is not walking away. The company is still building the Qashqai, the Juke, and its electric models there, still employing thousands of people across the UK and still investing in the site. So the honest verdict on Sunderland is not that Britain is being sold off. It is something more uncomfortable than that. For 40 years, the deal was that Britain built cars for the world. Nissan came here in the 1980s because this was a good place to make things, and Sunderland became the biggest and most productive car plant in the country. That was the arrangement. We made cars and other people bought them. The arrangement now being discussed at Sunderland is the reverse. Somebody else's cars, somebody else's design, somebody else's brand, built here because the space is going spare. That is still work. It is still 6,000 jobs, and it is still Sunderland. But it is a different position in the world from the one this country occupied when that plant opened. And you are entitled to feel something about that either way. Pride in the badge and the history is real. The need for steady jobs in the Northeast is also real. The two feelings can sit side by side. So what does any of this mean for the car you buy standing on a forecourt this weekend? First, buying a JQ or an Omoda or an MG is not a worse car simply because of where it is designed or built. The reviews are broadly good. The equipment levels are high and the warranties are usually longer than many established brands offer. If it suits your needs and your budget, buy it. Just go in knowing the brand is still new here, which affects two practical things. Second, resale. A brand with only 19 months of history in Britain has no residual value track record. Nobody knows yet what a 3-year-old JQ is worth because there has never been a 3-year-old JQ sitting on the used market in Britain. If you are buying on finance or personal contract purchase, that uncertainty sits on your side of the deal, not the dealer's. The monthly payments may look attractive, but the final balloon payment or the trade-in value 3 years later is harder to predict. Third, insurance. Some British insurers are quoting higher premiums on newly arrived Chinese models, and a few have declined to quote at all because the claims history they price from does not yet exist. Get a real quote on the exact model at your postcode before you sign anything, not after. A cheap purchase price can be wiped out by an expensive insurance policy. Fourth, servicing and parts. Check how many franchise dealers are within an hour of your home and ask how many there were a year ago. On a fast-growing network, that number is going up, which is good for you. On a shrinking one, it is going down, and that will matter to you more than any specification sheet ever does. And fifth, if you own a car from a British-built plant that is closed, Bridgend, Swindon, Luton, Longbridge, parts availability is worth checking before something breaks rather than after. Independent specialists usually fill that gap, and they are often cheaper than the dealer was anyway. The knowledge that used to live inside the original factory has to move somewhere else when the plant closes. 10 plants, 4 of them gone, 3 of them under pressure, and the biggest one in the country now discussing whether to build somebody else's cars to keep its second line running. Before you go, the record on these plants is confirmed. The closures at Bridgend, Swindon, Luton, and Longbridge and the job numbers attached to them, Chery's registration figures, and the 15% Chinese market share, the Freelander licensing arrangement, and the Nissan Chery Memorandum of Understanding itself, reported but not settled. Whether the Sunderland deal actually goes ahead, what it would build, and when that agreement is non-binding and either side can still walk away. Still developing are the questions of whether Freelander comes to Britain in volume and what happens to Sunderland's idle line if Chery walks away. The next 12 months will give clearer answers. So tell me in the comments, did you work at one of these plants, or did somebody in your family? Would you buy a Chinese car built in Sunderland by British workers? Or does the badge still matter to you more than the place of assembly? Tell me honestly, because I think this community is going to be split down the middle on this one, and I want to see where the line falls. And if this was worth your time, give it a like, send it to somebody who worked in the industry, and subscribe. I will keep following this story because the next 12 months at Sunderland will tell us a great deal about what British car manufacturing is going to look like from here.